The silence in the house had become a physical thing after Arthur passed. It was a weight that settled in the corners of rooms and pressed down on the furniture, leaving invisible impressions in the velvet of the armchair where he used to sit. For 40 years, the house had been a place of noise, of two growing boys, of dinner parties, of the television murmuring in the background. Now, it was just me and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, a sound that seemed to be counting down the seconds of my own remaining time rather than simply marking the passage of the day. It had been a year of firsts. The first birthday without him, the first anniversary alone, the first holiday season where the silence was so profound it felt like a scream. My son, Mark, and his wife, Clara, had suggested I sell the house. They said it was too big for one person, a constant and painful reminder. What they meant, I knew, was that it was an asset, sitting there, waiting. I had resisted. The house was not just brick and mortar. It was a library of my life. Every scuff on the floorboards, every chip in the paint on a doorframe held a memory. But the most precious things, the truest anchors to my past, were not part of the house itself. They were the pieces of furniture my mother had left me. They had come from her own parents' home, solid mahogany and cherry wood, crafted by hands long turned to dust. There was the writing desk with its secret compartment where she kept my father's letters, the towering armoire that smelled faintly of lavender and cedar, and the vanity table with the threefold mirror where I had watched her brush her silver hair 100 times. These were not just objects. They were history. They were my mother's presence, a tangible link to the woman who had shaped me. Mark and Clara visited on Sundays. Their visits felt less like a comfort and more like an inspection. Clara would walk through the rooms, her eyes scanning everything with a look that was not admiration, but assessment. She would run a finger over a dusty surface, her lips tightening. She called the furniture cluttered and dated. Mark, my own son, would stand by, nodding in agreement, his hands in his pockets. He had Arthur's height, but none of his warmth. He had become a stranger to me in the months after his father's funeral, his grief manifesting as a cool impatience. He wanted me to move on, which I understood to mean he wanted me to get out of the way. My sister, Eleanor, lived in a small seaside town 3 hours away. She had been begging me to come for a visit, to get away from the house and its suffocating memories for a little while. I kept putting it off, reluctant to leave my routine, my quiet sorrow. But one morning, the silence felt heavier than usual. The ticking clock sounded accusatory. I called Eleanor and told her I would come for a week. I needed the sea air. I needed to see a different set of walls. Mark and Clara were pleased when I told them. Clara even offered to come by while I was gone, to air the place out and water my plants. Her enthusiasm felt sharp, unsettling. I should have listened to that small, quiet voice of unease, but I was tired. I was tired of being suspicious, tired of feeling like a custodian of a museum no one wanted to visit. I thanked her, gave her the spare key I kept on a hook by the door, and packed a small bag. As I left, I took one last look at the living room. The afternoon sun was streaming through the windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing over my mother's writing desk. It looked peaceful. It looked safe. The week with Eleanor was a balm. We walked on the beach, the salty wind whipping our hair. We drank tea and talked about our childhoods, about our parents, about the men we had married and the children we had raised. We laughed for the first time in what felt like a year. The weight in my chest began to lift, ever so slightly. By the end of the week, I felt stronger, more like myself. I felt ready to go back and face the quiet house. I drove home with a sense of renewed purpose, a fragile sort of peace settling over me. I pulled into the driveway and noticed the first thing that was wrong. The curtains in the living room window, the heavy damask ones that had belonged to my mother, were gone. In their place were thin, white, modern-looking panels. They looked stark and cheap. My heart began to beat a little faster. I told myself there was a simple explanation. Perhaps Clara had taken the old ones to be cleaned. It was a kind thought, a helpful gesture. I clung to that possibility as I unlocked the front door. The smell hit me first. It was the scent of lemon-scented cleaning products, harsh and chemical. It had scoured the familiar scent of old wood, beeswax, and my own rosewater perfume from the air. The house felt sterile, alien, and then I saw it. The living room was empty. Not just empty of the curtains, but empty of everything that mattered. My mother's writing desk was gone. The matching mahogany bookshelf was gone. The little velvet footstool she had needle-pointed herself was gone. The space where they had stood for 40 years was now just a collection of pale rectangles on the hardwood floor where the sun had not reached. I stood there in the doorway, my overnight bag slipping from my numb fingers. I could not process what I was seeing. It felt like a violation, a burglary of the soul. I walked slowly into the room, my footsteps echoing in the sudden cavernous space. I went from room to room. The dining room was next. The long cherry wood table, the one that had hosted every Thanksgiving and Christmas dinner of my children's lives, was gone. The matching set of 12 chairs, gone. The tall, glass-fronted china cabinet that held my grandmother's wedding china, gone. In their place was a cheap, flat-pack dining set, the kind you see in a student apartment. It was light-colored wood, flimsy and offensive in its modernity. My bedroom was the final, deepest wound. The armoire, the beautiful monolithic piece that had stood against the far wall since I moved in as a bride, was gone. My clothes were piled in plastic tubs on the floor, and the vanity, my mother's vanity, the place I sat every morning to prepare for the day, was gone. Its absence was a physical blow. I could feel the ghost of it, the memory of its shape in the air. I sank down onto the edge of my bed, the room spinning around me. My house had been hollowed out. My memories had been stolen. I did not cry. The shock was too deep for tears. It was a cold, sharp thing, a shard of ice in my gut. There was only one possible explanation. I pulled my phone from my purse, my hands shaking so badly I could barely dial the number. Clara answered on the second ring, her voice bright and cheerful. She asked me if I had a nice trip. I could not bring myself to answer her question. My own voice was flat, devoid of all emotion. I asked her where my furniture was. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Then she laughed. It was a light, tinkling sound, and it was the most grotesque thing I had ever heard. She told me not to worry. She said she had done me a favor. She and Mark had decided to surprise me. They had cleared out all that old junk, as she called it, that heavy, dark, depressing furniture that was just weighing the place down. She said they had donated it to a charity that helps families in need. She sounded so proud of herself, so certain of her own generosity. Old junk. The words echoed in the empty room. My mother's life, my grandmother's life. The physical embodiment of my entire family history dismissed as old junk, donated, given away as if it had no more value than a bag of worn-out clothes. I did not say anything. I could not form a response. The line was silent for a long moment, and then Clara's voice lost some of its cheer. She asked if I was there. She asked if I was happy with the surprise. She said the house looked so much lighter now, so much more modern. She said they had even bought me some new things to get me started, gesturing with her voice toward the cheap particle board replacements that now squatted in my home. I ended the call without saying another word. I just pressed the button and let the phone fall onto the bed beside me. The coldness in my stomach was spreading, turning my limbs to lead. I sat there for a very long time, staring at the empty space where the armoire had been. I saw my mother standing in front of it, a girl of 16 admiring the dress she would wear to her first dance. I saw myself, a young bride, carefully folding Arthur's shirts and placing them inside. I saw my son, Mark, as a little boy, hiding inside it during a game of hide-and-seek, his giggles muffled by the hanging clothes. All of those moments, all of that life, had been contained within that wood, and now it was gone. declared junk, and discarded. The initial shock began to recede, replaced by a slow, burning anger. It was a kind of anger I had never felt before. It was not hot and explosive, but cold and methodical. It clarified my thoughts. Donated. Clara had said they donated it. But her voice, the slight hesitation before she answered, the forced brightness, it had not rung true. It felt rehearsed. Something was wrong with her story. It was too neat, too self-congratulatory. People like Clara and Mark, people who measured the world in dollars and cents, did not simply give away valuable antiques. I stood up. My body felt stiff, ancient. I walked back into the living room and looked at the pale outlines on the floor. I began to think. If they had donated it, there would be a record, a receipt for the tax deduction, if nothing else. Clara was meticulous about things like that. I went to the small table by the door where we kept the mail. The pile was neat, organized. I sifted through it. Bills, junk mail, a letter from my cousin. Nothing from a charity. Nothing at all. My mind started working, piecing things together. I remembered conversations from the past few months. Mark complaining about a deal that had fallen through at his work. Clara lamenting the cost of the private school for my granddaughter, Lily. Vague mentions of being stretched thin. At the time, I had offered to help, but they had brushed it off, assuring me everything was fine. Now, those comments took on a sinister new meaning. They needed money. And they had looked at my house, at my life, and seen a solution. I started to search. My first stop was the local Goodwill and the Salvation Army donation centers. I drove to each one, my heart pounding with a mixture of dread and a desperate, foolish hope. I described the furniture to the managers, the mahogany desk with the slight wobble in the back left leg, the cherry dining table with the small, heart-shaped water stain that Mark had made with a cold glass when he was 10. They were polite, but they shook their heads. Nothing matching that description had come in. Not recently, not ever. They dealt mostly in pressboard and worn-out sofas, not 18th century heirlooms. The hope began to curdle into certainty. They had not donated it. They had lied. The lie was so blatant, so insulting in its assumption of my gullibility. They thought I was a foolish old woman who would simply accept their story, who would be grateful for the cheap replacements and the newly modern space. They had not counted on me looking. They had not counted on me thinking. They had underestimated me. That was their first mistake. I went home and turned on the computer. My technical skills were limited, but I knew how to use a search engine. I started typing in keywords. Antique mahogany desk. Cherry wood dining set. I scrolled through pages of images, my eyes aching from the screen's glare. Nothing. I tried local online marketplaces, Craigslist, Facebook Marketplace. I searched for hours, my anger solidifying with every fruitless click. It was like looking for a ghost. The next day, I widened my search. I started calling antique stores. I began with the ones in my town, then methodically worked my way out to the surrounding counties. I described the pieces again and again, my voice a monotone of forced calm. Most of the owners were kind but unhelpful. They offered their sympathy, but had seen nothing. I was about to give up for the day when I spoke to a man named Mr. Harris, the owner of a small dusty shop in a town 40 miles away. I started with the writing desk. As I described the intricate carvings on the legs and the secret compartment, he interrupted me. He asked me to repeat the description of the inlay, the small mother-of-pearl star on the corner. My breath caught in my throat. I described it exactly. There was a long silence on the line. Then, he said very quietly that a desk matching that description was on his showroom floor right now. He said it was part of a set that a young couple had brought in for consignment about 5 days ago. The blood drained from my face. I felt dizzy and I had to sit down. A young couple. 5 days ago, while I was at Eleanor's. I asked him to describe the other pieces. He listed them, one by one. the bookshelf, the dining table, the china cabinet, the armoire, the vanity. He described them perfectly, right down to the small imperfections that I knew, like the lines on my own hand. It was all there, my mother's life, for sale in a dusty shop 40 miles away. I asked him, my voice trembling, about the people who had brought them in. He was hesitant at first, citing client confidentiality. I did not plead. I did not cry. I simply told him that the furniture had been taken from my home without my permission while I was away. I told him it belonged to my late mother and was priceless to me. There was a shift in his tone. He was a man who understood the stories that objects hold. He told me he could not give me their names, but he could tell me that the consignment contract was signed by a Mark Peterson. Mark Peterson, my son, my only son. The confirmation was a physical blow, harder than the sight of the empty rooms. The lie was one thing. The theft was another. But the signature on the contract, that was a betrayal so profound I had no words for it. He had not just allowed Clara to do this. He had been her active partner. He had driven my mother's legacy to a stranger and signed it away for money. I thanked Mr. Harris, my voice a dry whisper. I told him I would be there the next morning. I asked him not to sell any of the pieces. He promised he would hold them. He said he would have the consignment contract ready for me to see. I hung up the phone and sat in the echoing silence of my living room. The anger was gone now, burned out completely. In its place was a vast, cold emptiness. I felt nothing at all. It was as if a switch had been flipped inside me, turning off all the grief and the pain and the love I had felt for my son. That night, I did not sleep. I sat in the dark thinking. I replayed my life, my marriage, my motherhood. I saw every sacrifice I had made, every scraped knee I had bandaged, every school project I had helped with, every late night I had waited up. I had poured my entire existence into my family, into my husband and my sons. I had thought that love was a currency that would be returned. I realized now that for Mark it had only ever been a transaction. He had been waiting for his inheritance, and his patience had simply run out. The next morning, I confronted them. I called and told them I needed to talk. I did not say why. They arrived together, smiling, asking if I was feeling better, if I was getting used to the new look. The sight of their cheerful, oblivious faces made me feel sick. I did not invite them to sit down. I stood in the middle of the living room, a solitary figure in the empty space, and I looked at my son. I told him I had found the furniture. I watched the color drain from his face. Clara's smile froze, then vanished. She started to speak, to babble about a misunderstanding, but I held up a hand and she fell silent. My gaze did not leave Mark. I told him I had spoken to Mr. Harris. I told him I knew he had signed the consignment papers. I watched the denial in his eyes crumble, replaced by a sullen, childish anger. He could not even meet my gaze. He stared at the floor, at the pale rectangle where my mother's desk had been. He finally looked at me, his eyes full of resentment. He said they needed the money. He said I was not using the furniture anyway, that it was just sitting here, collecting dust. He said it was old-fashioned and that I should be grateful for the new, modern things they had bought me. He spoke as if he were the victim, as if I had somehow wronged him by holding on to my own property, my own memories. There was no apology. There was no remorse. There was only the selfish justification of a thief. Clara chimed in then, her voice sharp and defensive. She told me I was being sentimental and dramatic. It was just stuff, she said, old wood. She told me I had plenty of money, that I did not need it. She said they were my family and they deserved to be supported. Her words, meant to wound me, did nothing. I was beyond being hurt by them. I was in a place of cold, clear observation. I was seeing them for the first time, not as my son and his wife, but as two greedy strangers who had invaded my home and my life. I listened to them, their excuses and their accusations, and I felt nothing. The The love I had held for my son, the maternal bond that had defined my life for 40 years, had been severed. It had been cut away as cleanly as if with a surgeon's knife. The person standing before me was not the boy I had raised. He was a man I did not know, and a man I no longer wanted to know. The emptiness inside me was profound. It was the lowest point of my life, a grief deeper than the one I had felt for my husband, because this was a living death, the death of a relationship, the death of a family. I realized in that moment that my life as a mother, as a caretaker, as the accommodating, self-sacrificing matriarch, was over. That role had been predicated on a love that I now saw was entirely one-sided. It had been a lie. My entire family identity had been a lie. I had been a resource to them, a well from which they could draw until it ran dry. I had been a convenience, a placeholder, a bank account. I had not been a person. I had not been a mother they loved, but an obstacle they had to manage. They were still talking, their voices rising in pitch, a symphony of self-pity and entitlement. And then, something inside me shifted. The emptiness began to fill, not with the old warmth, but with something new. It was hard and sharp and clear, like ice. The tears I had not shed, the grief I had been holding back, it all crystallized into a single unshakable resolve. I was done crying. I was done being a victim. I was done being their mother. A new phase of my life was beginning. It would be a time for consequences. It would be a time for justice. I waited for them to run out of words. When they finally fell silent, panting slightly in the empty room, I spoke. My voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that made them both flinch. I told them to leave my house. I told them they were no longer welcome here. Mark started to protest, to say this was his family home, but I cut him off. I told him it was my house, bought and paid for with money that I and his father had earned. He had no claim on it. He had forfeited that claim when he had signed my mother's name away. They stared at me, their faces a mixture of shock and disbelief. They had never heard me use this tone before. I had always been the peacemaker, the one to smooth things over. They did not recognize this cold, resolute woman who stood before them. I walked to the front door and opened it. I told them to get out. Clara grabbed Mark's arm, her face pale, and pulled him toward the door. As they left, Mark turned back to look at me, a flicker of something, fear, confusion, in his eyes. I just looked at him, my face a mask of stone, and I closed the door in his face. I turned the deadbolt, and the sound of it sliding into place was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. The next day, I did not go to the antique store. Instead, I made a different call. I called Arthur's old friend, a man named George Maxwell, who had been our lawyer for 30 years. I had not spoken to him since the funeral, but he remembered me instantly. I told him I needed his help. I told him what had happened, my voice calm and factual as I laid out the entire sordid story. I did not embellish. I did not get emotional. I just stated the facts, the furniture, the lies, the consignment shop, the confession. George listened patiently, his silence a comforting presence on the other end of the line. When I was finished, he did not offer platitudes or sympathy. He simply said, "The thieving little scoundrels." His validation was like a drink of cold water. He told me not to go to the antique shop myself. He said he would handle it. He told me to sit tight and not to speak to Mark or Clara under any circumstances. He said he would start making some inquiries. The first thing George did was call Mr. Harris at the antique store. He explained the situation legally, and Mr. Harris was more than happy to cooperate. He faxed George a copy of the consignment contract. There it was, in black and white, a list of my mother's furniture with my son's signature at the bottom. George also discovered something else. The address Mark had given on the form was not his own. It was mine. He had claimed to be the owner of the property, residing at my address, acting on his own behalf. This, George explained, was not just theft, it was fraud. George then advised me to do something I had never thought I would have to do. He told me to check my finances. He reminded me that during the last few months of Arthur's illness, I had given Mark a limited power of attorney to help me pay bills and manage the estate paperwork. I had been so overwhelmed with caregiving and grief that I had barely looked at the statements. I had trusted him completely. That trust now felt like a staggering act of naivete. With a growing sense of dread, I pulled out the boxes of bank statements and credit card bills from the past year. I spread them out on the new, cheap dining table, a bitter irony that did not escape me. I started going through them, line by line. At first, everything seemed normal: the mortgage payments, the utilities, the grocery bills. But then I started to notice things. Small charges at first, a fancy restaurant I had never been to, an online clothing store I had never heard of. Then the charges got bigger: a weekend trip to a spa resort, a down payment on a new car for Clara. It was all there. A systematic siphoning of my accounts, a slow and steady bleed. He had been stealing from me for months, long before he had stolen the furniture. The furniture had not been an act of desperation. It had been an escalation. He had grown bolder, more entitled. The total was staggering. He had stolen tens of thousands of dollars. He had been paying for his lavish lifestyle with his father's life insurance money I had set aside for my own old age. The discovery did not bring more pain. The pain had been cauterized. What I felt was a clean, purifying rage. He had not just stolen my mother's things. He had stolen my husband's legacy. He had stolen my security. He had stolen my future. George was not surprised when I called him back and told him what I had found. He just sighed and said it was a classic pattern. He told me we had a very strong case. He asked me what I wanted to do. I did not have to think about it. My path was clear. I wanted everything back, not just the furniture. I wanted every single cent he had stolen. And I wanted him to face the consequences of his actions. I was not interested in forgiveness. I was not interested in reconciliation. Forgiveness was for mistakes. This was not a mistake. This was a calculated series of choices, a prolonged campaign of deception and theft against his own mother. I told George to proceed with whatever legal action was necessary. I wanted to press charges. George set the plan in motion. The first step was to secure my assets. He had me go to the bank and revoke the power of attorney immediately. I opened new accounts at a different bank and transferred the majority of my funds, leaving only a small amount in the old, compromised accounts. We changed the locks on the house. George's office drafted a new will, one that explicitly disinherited Mark and Clara. My estate would now be left to my granddaughter, Lily, to be held in trust until she was 25, and a portion to my sister Eleanor. While George's team prepared the legal case, I had another task. I had to get the furniture back. George had arranged it. The police were notified of the fraudulent consignment, and they accompanied me to the antique store. Mr. Harris was waiting for us. He led me through his shop, past rows of other people's histories, to a corner at the back. And there they were, my mother's things. They looked out of place, adrift under the fluorescent lights of the shop. They looked sad. I ran my hand over the cool, smooth surface of the writing desk. I felt a surge of relief so powerful it almost brought me to my knees. It was like finding a part of myself that had been lost. Mr. Harris was incredibly kind. He was furious on my behalf, telling the police officer how disgusted he was by the whole affair. The furniture was officially seized as evidence, to be returned to me once the legal formalities were complete. I left the shop feeling like I had won the first battle in a long war. The next few weeks were a blur of legal paperwork and quiet waiting. Mark and Clara tried to contact me. They called dozens of times a day. They left long, rambling voicemails. At first, they were angry, demanding to know what I was doing. Then, as the reality of their situation began to dawn on them, the messages turned to pleading. Clara cried, saying it was all a terrible misunderstanding. Mark promised to pay me back, to make it right. I did not listen to any of the messages in full. I just saw their names on the caller ID and deleted them. I had nothing to say to them. George was my voice now. The final confrontation was not a dramatic shouting match. It was something far quieter and far more devastating. George had advised that we arrange a meeting at his office. He sent them a formal letter, and they agreed to come. They must have thought it was a chance to negotiate, to talk me around. They walked into the conference room looking nervous but hopeful. I was already sitting at the long, polished table with George beside me. I did not look at them. I just stared at the blank legal pad in front of me. George did all the talking. He laid it all out for them, calmly and professionally. He had a file in front of him, thick with evidence. He detailed the fraudulent consignment. He had bank statements highlighted, showing the unauthorized transfers and purchases. He had a copy of the new power of attorney revocation. He had a copy of the police report. He spoke for 20 minutes without interruption. Mark and Clara just sat there, their faces growing paler with every word. When George was finished, he folded his hands and looked at them. He told them I was prepared to press full criminal charges for fraud and theft. He explained what that would mean: arrest, a trial, and very likely a prison sentence for Mark. Clara began to sob, a theatrical gulping sound. Mark just stared at me, his mouth slightly open, his face a mask of disbelief. He seemed unable to comprehend that I, his quiet, accommodating mother, could be capable of this. Then, George offered them a choice. He said I was willing to forgo the criminal charges on one condition. They had to sign a full confession and a legally binding agreement. The agreement stated that they would repay every cent they had stolen, with interest, over a period of 5 years. The amount would be garnished from Mark's wages. It also stipulated that they would relinquish any and all future claims to my estate. And finally, it included a restraining order, preventing them from coming within 500 feet of me or my property. They would be legally barred from my life. Mark looked at me then, his eyes begging. He started to speak, to call me Mom, but his voice broke. This was his last chance, his last attempt to appeal to the mother he thought he knew. I finally lifted my head and met his gaze. My expression was blank. I felt nothing. No pity, no anger, no love, just a vast, quiet distance. I looked through him as if he were a ghost. I spoke for the first and only time in that meeting. My voice was low and clear. I told him that my son would never have done this to me. I told him I did not know who he was. And then I said the words that severed the final tie. I told him that as far as I was concerned, my son had died a year ago with his father. The man sitting across from me was a stranger, and I owed him nothing. The finality in my voice seemed to break him. He slumped in his chair, all the fight gone out of him. Clara was still crying, but now her sobs were quiet, defeated. George pushed the papers across the table toward them. He told them to read them carefully and sign. They did. Their hands trembled as they signed away their connection to me, their signatures like the final lines in a story that had come to a bitter end. After they signed, they were escorted out of the office by one of George's assistants. I did not watch them go. I just sat there, staring at the signed papers. George put a hand on my shoulder. He asked me if I was all right. I nodded. I was not happy. I was not triumphant. I felt a deep, somber sense of resolution. It was the feeling of a necessary surgery having been performed. The diseased part of my life had been cut away. The wound was clean, but it would leave a scar. The fallout was swift and brutal for them. The wage garnishment hit Mark's career hard. They had to sell their large house and move into a small rental apartment. Clara's friends, who had once admired her new car and expensive clothes, dropped her when the story came out. Their social standing evaporated overnight. I heard whispers about it through my sister Eleanor, who heard it from a distant cousin. They were disgraced, financially ruined, and socially isolated. I took no pleasure in this knowledge. It was simply the logical outcome of their choices. It was the sound of a debt being paid. My furniture was returned to me a week later. The moving men were gentle, placing each piece back in its rightful spot. As the armoire was settled against my bedroom wall, as the writing desk was placed back in the sunlit spot in the living room, I felt the house begin to breathe again. The sterile, chemical smell was gone. The familiar scent of old wood and beeswax returned. The house was no longer empty. It was full of my history again. It was my home. I lived in the big house for another 6 months, but it had changed. The silence was different now. It was no longer the heavy, grief-stricken silence of loss. It was a lighter, more peaceful silence, the silence of solitude, not loneliness. But the house was still too big. It was full of memories of a family that no longer existed. I realized that Mark and Clara had been right about one thing, though for all the wrong reasons. It was time for me to move on, not from my past, but from the stage on which that painful final act had played out. I sold the house. I found a wonderful young family with 2 small children who fell in love with it. I watched them, their eyes full of dreams for the future, and I felt a sense of peace. The house would be filled with noise and laughter again. It deserved that. I took only the things that truly mattered: my mother's furniture, my books, my photographs, and a few of Arthur's favorite things. I bought a small condominium in a quiet building overlooking a park. It had 2 bedrooms, a small balcony, and large windows that let in the morning light. It was perfect. I arranged my mother's furniture carefully. The writing desk fit perfectly under the window in the living room. The armoire stood proudly in my new bedroom. They did not look cluttered or dated. They looked beautiful. They looked loved. My life found a new rhythm. It was a quiet rhythm, a steady one. I joined a book club. I started volunteering at the local library. I took up gardening again, filling my balcony with pots of herbs and flowers. I reconnected with old friends. I spent weekends with Eleanor. My days were my own. They were not defined by anyone else's needs or expectations. For the first time in my life, I was living entirely for myself. And I discovered that I was very good company. There was one loose thread, one piece of the old life that I had not cut away. My granddaughter, Lily. She was 16, a smart, quiet girl with my mother's eyes. She had been caught in the middle of the ugly implosion of her family. After that day in the lawyer's office, she had called me. She was crying. She told me she had known something was wrong. She had heard her parents arguing about money. She told me she was horrified and ashamed of what they had done. She asked if she could still see me. Her call was a ray of light in the darkness. I told her of course she could. I told her that none of this was her fault. I told her that I loved her. She became my regular visitor. She would come over after school and we would sit and talk. She loved my mother's furniture. She would trace the carvings on the armoire and ask me stories about her great-grandmother. She saw it not as old junk but as her heritage. She was the one worthy successor to that legacy. In Lily, I saw the continuation of the best parts of my family. She had her grandfather's kindness and my mother's strength. She was the proof that the line was not broken, that the values I held dear had not vanished from the earth. Our relationship was not based on obligation or transaction. It was based on genuine affection and mutual respect. We were building a new kind of family, a smaller, quieter one, built on a foundation of truth. One afternoon, Lily and I were sitting on the balcony drinking iced tea. She was telling me about a book she was reading for school. She looked up at me, her expression serious. She asked me if I ever missed him. She meant Mark, her father. I considered the question for a long time. I thought about the little boy who held my hand, the teenager who towered over me, the man who had walked me down the aisle at his wedding. And I felt a pang, not of love, but of a distant, sorrowful nostalgia for someone who no longer existed. I told her that I missed the son I thought I had. I missed the family I thought we were. But I did not miss the man he had become. I explained to her that sometimes love is not enough. Sometimes the hurt is too deep, the betrayal too complete. Forgiveness, I told her, is a gift, and it is a gift that must be earned. It is not owed to anyone, not even your own child. What is owed is respect. What is owed is honesty And when those things are destroyed, love cannot survive. It starves. It is never too late to reclaim your life. For years, I believed my identity was tied to being a wife and a mother. When one was taken from me by death and the other by betrayal, I felt lost. I thought my story was over, but I was wrong. By standing up for myself, by refusing to be a victim, by choosing my own dignity over a broken and false relationship, I found a new chapter, a chapter that was all my own. I look around my small, sunlit home now, at the beautiful wood that holds the stories of my family, and I feel a profound sense of peace. It is a quiet life, a simple life, but it is an honest one. I have learned the difference between solitude and loneliness. I have learned that the heaviest things we carry are not pieces of furniture, but the weight of lies and unmet expectations. And I have learned that the most important house you will ever live in is the one you build inside yourself, a place of self-respect where you are the sole and undisputed owner. My name is on the deed, and no one can ever take that away from me again.